So happy to be here to talk to you about fortifying healthcare in the cloud, strategies for cyber resilience and data protection. So, a little glimpse about some things that can help you out, and super excited to be able to share with you today. All right, so first up, just a brief agenda. Here's what we're going to try to cover here today. We'll start with the state of cybersecurity and healthcare in the cloud, that is, what's driving change and what threats we face. And from there, I'll walk through some of them, what I consider some of the most important core strategies for protecting healthcare in the cloud. We'll also look at how AI is reshaping both security and healthcare itself. And finally, I'll share some strategic recommendations before opening it up for a bit of questions and answers. So hopefully you're excited. I'm excited to be here to help you as well. All right. So first up, the state of healthcare that is in the cloud, those threats, trends, and transformations. Healthcare really it's undergoing some massive transformations in how it delivers care. Things like cloud adoption, it's really fueling everything from electronic health records to telehealth, even hybrid work models. I love that, being able to work from home. I'm sure some of the medical staff are experiencing that. Things like acceleration, though those come with risk, of course, right? We've seen as you've heard from some of the other speakers today about ransomware and how they continue to target patient data and hospital operations. Things like misconfigurations in the cloud could lead to essentially sensitive data exposure, those types of things. Insider threats, whether they're malicious or accidental, they also of course pose a serious risk to us. And let's not forget about all those regulatory landscape things that have been talked about, I'm sure, HIPAA, high tech, and even GDPR for those of you dealing with the European Union, of course. Basically, healthcare organizations are under a lot of pressure, immense pressure, not just to deliver care, but to also prove that they have compliance every step of the way. And the cloud, although it brings a lot of agility and innovation, without discipline, security, and compliance, it can also magnify our vulnerabilities, of course, out there. And we've seen a broad set of broad challenges in healthcare when it comes to cloud security. Well, let's take a look at a real world example that have brought these risks to life. You may have heard of this, and that is the Change Healthcare incident, right? And so, for those of you who haven't heard of the Change Healthcare breach in February of 2024, this was a huge wake up call, I should say. This wasn't just another ransomware attack, it really disrupted half of the prescription drugs in drug payments, that is, in the United States for weeks. The company ended up paying a whopping $22 million ransom. But the fallout didn't end there, right? Criminal affiliates who weren't paid turned around and leaked stolen patient data, potentially affecting half of the US population. Now, the attack drew national attention with congressional inquiries, and of course, lots of stronger protections were asked for across the sector. Now, the financial impact to United Health Group is expected to potentially exceed $1 billion. Of course, the big lesson here, the scary story part of this lesson, is a single breach can really cause major damage. It can cause ripple effects, so to speak, across the healthcare ecosystem, delaying things like care, threatening patient privacy, damaging trust, of course, to our organization. Now, this incident shows the cost of being unprepared, of course. So, what can we do? What strategies can we put in place to build resilience? So, let's start with one of my first core strategies, zero trust. Now, you might be thinking, oh my gosh, another zero trust, conversation. Yeah, I know it's a big buzzword, of course, but I really do believe in it, beyond the marketing hype and what have you out there. It really is a mindset. The idea, of course, is to never trust, to always verify, especially at the identity layer, right? And so I will bring this up, really zoom in close to this and tell you laser focus. You need laser focus. I can't stress it enough on the identity layer, right? When it comes to zero trust, identity, that is crucial. You really, again, need to have that laser focus on this capability to work in a zero trust type of environment. This is where we enforce things like strict access controls, of course, multi-factor authentication, and what have you. So, of course, it's very important, but it's not the only thing. So, devices, we must continuously monitor their posture and block those that don't meet our security standards out there. Things like networks, they should be micro segmented, so a breach in one area, basically they can't move around, right? Move and pivot to somewhere else. Things like applications and workloads, we need to enforce things like isolation and have a well-defined access policy in place. And of course, data, that treasure trove, that all that awesome information must be consistently classified. We need to know where it exists and protect it across its life cycle. So, of course, this is a very simple look at zero trust, but by layering these controls, we can minimize the risk that single weakness compromising potentially your whole environment. Now, zero trust, of course, that creates a foundation, you could say, but the data itself remains our crown jewel, that treasure trove, so to speak. That brings us to our next core strategy, and that is protecting data in the cloud itself. All right, so our core strategy number two, data protection in the cloud. This is where healthcare runs on data, right? Patient records, lab results, billing information, and that data is a prime target. Our first step is classification. If you don't know where the PHI, that health information or that personally identifiable information resides, you can't protect it. So once classified, once you know where it exists, encryption, of course, becomes the baseline. At rest, in transit, and essentially even in use. So things like backups, of course, are going to become very important. They need to be immutable and geographically diverse to survive things like ransomwares, right? So we really need to be conscious of the fact of that if we have one cloud provider and we have backups, where do we store them in a completely separate, diverse place? Architectures, of course, we need to come up with ways to support that resilience using things like object locking, that is, and versioning, of course, as well. And these are some of those native cloud solutions out there that can truly help us out when we're working in the cloud with our healthcare environment. And finally, of course, access management. I talked a lot about identity a moment ago in the zero trust environment, ensuring things like essentially role based access control. Only the right people have access to the data at any given time. Now, these aren't optional in healthcare, they're required to keep your data safe and, of course, under that compliance that we kind of referred to earlier. Now, once your data is secure, we also need to keep that environment in check. This is where things like CSPM, which we'll talk about next, plays a critical role. All right. So CSPM, if you haven't heard of that before, this is the cloud security posture management. This is where it comes in to help us with these complex and ever-changing environments. So basically, the way it can essentially a CSPM works is it's going to continually scan your cloud environments for any kind of misconfigurations. Things like exposed storage buckets, for example, or maybe you have overly broad identity and access management policies. It enforces compliance against those regulatory frameworks, things like HIPAA, things like GDPR, all in real time. And it automates that idea, that principle of least privilege, our mantra in the world of security. Now, CSPM also plays a critical role in multi-cloud environments. So if you're not multi-cloud, well, I doubt it, but because most of us are multi-cloud in some capacity, whether we're using SaaS or PaaS or IaaS, we need to maintain some level of visibility and ensure a consistent security posture when it comes to having two or three or four or 10 or hundreds for that matter of cloud platforms. It can be really challenging in order to see the posture across all these different environments. So in healthcare, of course, where one misstep, literally one misstep in a SaaS provider could mean exposing millions of patient records. As an example, a CSPM can help you provide a safety net that is, and constantly monitoring, flagging risk, ensuring policies, and essentially remain essentially in a safe zone, so to speak, with all these services that are being deployed out there. So CSPM is one of the tools of choice that can help you across this different landscape. And of course, even with security and strong posture management like this, Incidents are going to happen. So we need to be prepared, that is. And that's the difference between what I refer to as between chaos and control. And so being prepared, right? That idea of instant response readiness, because incidents are going to happen. It's not just a matter of if, but it's when, right? It's that difference that comes down to how prepared are we, right? Our cloud specific instant response plans are going to be very, very critical. Now, what works on premise isn't necessarily going to work the same in the cloud. So we need to have really good contracts with our cloud providers. If we need logs, for example, from them, and an instant response is a good example. Do we have a good relationship with them into being able to take advantage of those logs when we need to do some kind of investigation? So we again, of course, have centralized logging and monitoring needs to give us that full visibility across all of our sprawling environments. And how do you get better at incident response? Nothing like a good old fashioned tabletop exercise to help us out, understanding our roles, whether we're executives or we're detection engineers or we're business line people or whatever happens to be. So basically, there's no confusion whenever the real thing happens, when that real attack happens. And of course, most importantly, we need to have that mindset of being prepared always, always being prepared. Organizations that treat IR or instant response as just a check the box kind of thing, they're going to find themselves pretty overwhelmed when it really happens. And it will, guaranteed. I mean, I haven't worked with a single organization that hasn't gone through at least a minor incident, if not a major incident. So that preparation, of course, is going to be pretty vital. And we have a need for speed, you could say, a need for scaling out. And this is where things like artificial intelligence, AI, that is, can start to help transform how we as healthcare defenders, that is, can defend against these kinds of attacks in the cloud themselves. So I called it jokingly the multivitamin for AI multivitamin here to strengthen our healthcare in the cloud. And AI is becoming a force multiplier, you could say, for the healthcare security mindset. Things like machine learning can detect unusual behaviors, like a doctor, for example, accessing hundreds of patient records outside of normal hours. Things like predictive risk modeling helps us forecast vulnerabilities and prioritize which ones to patch first is another good example. Now we have compliance automation to help reduce the burden of audits by assessing those controls that we have, those CPs, those control procedures in place in real time. Now AI also can help strengthen DLP or data loss prevention, detecting things like sensitive data in unstructured text, things like notes or emails, that type of thing. And during incidents, AI can help us tremendously by helping us triage alerts, analyze root causes, and accelerate containment. Done right, done well, AI doesn't necessarily replace people per se, but it does enhance their ability to secure healthcare in real time. Now, AI, of course, it strengthens security, but it is also, of course, reshaping healthcare itself. So let's shift for a moment to see how AI is changing healthcare, that is, patient care as well. All right. So a little story here for you. This slide's sort of dedicated to my mom. When I was a boy growing up, I grew up in a very, very small town in Texas. Sorry, yeah, from Texas. Yeah. So getting healthcare in a small town in Texas wasn't always that convenient as living in like a big city, a metropolitan area, that type of thing. So my mom, she was a nurse, relied on information from things like a physician's desk reference or PDR. You may have heard of these before if you've ever seen them, the big red books like shown in this image here, to look up things like symptoms, medications, etc. Now, obviously, the world has changed dramatically since then, and AI is not just transforming cybersecurity, it's transforming patient care delivery itself. Healthcare providers are overwhelmed by complexities of all kinds, things like drug interactions, genetic markers, family histories, any number of different things. And they're, of course, they're under that constant threat of malpractice or external pressures as well. Doctors are under immense pressure to deal with these kinds of things. And patients, they're coming in with all kinds of expectations. They're shaped by the advertising out there and digital type of information as well. AI is going to influence them. So AI in general is going to be processing enormous amounts of volumes of data, giving you insights, helping you to be better, faster, and provide safer care decisions. So from diagnosis to treatment planning, AI is becoming also a trusted assistant, helping doctors manage complexity and focusing on what matters most, of course, that's the patient care itself. Now, while AI promises better care, our defenders also suffer from the same kind of struggles as well inside the Cloud Security Operations Center. So let's take a look at that reality. All right. So yeah, let's step into the cloud sock. The reality is pretty hard these days. It's pretty harsh, I should say, right? Analysts they're drowning in all these alerts. There's just so much information, so much telemetry that is. How do they know which ones are the most important? And essentially, how do they deal with all this tremendous amount of information? Manual processes, they're going to slow this all down, makes it pretty impossible to scale and tools themselves, and I love tools, so don't get me wrong. Tools themselves are becoming really fragmented, creating blind spots and inefficiencies as well. How do we deal with those kinds of things? And of course, you probably all know this as well. The skilled talent out there, it's really scarce. We need so many people these days to work in cybersecurity, and the SOC is definitely one of those areas when it comes to protecting our cloud environments. And many of these people, unfortunately, are getting burned out by essentially all of this really harsh kind of reality. That's an uphill battle, you could say. We're facing this every day, securing the healthcare and the cloud. Now, despite all these challenges, right, there is a path forward. And I do think AI is going to help us rise above, so to speak, and turn the tide in security operations out there. I'm pretty excited about a lot of the tool sets. And essentially, what I mean by that is several years ago, I had hair. You believe it or not, I had hair once. It was short, thick, and stylish, right? And then instant response happening. Ha ha. Just kidding. Now I don't, I don't invest in shampoo. I invest in coffee because I'm up all night, right? Just kidding, of course, right? But despite all of these challenges that I was referring to, there's a lot of hope. AI is going to give us the ability to rise above these tools that are being built, that are being produced, helps reduce things like false positives so your analyst can really focus on the real problem, the real threats. It can also help us with detection accuracy, scaling that human capacity without having to add a lot more people, which is a problem with that scarcity of talent out there. It also helps us to respond faster, breaking that cycle of fatigue and inefficiency. Basically, in short, AI is going to transform, I believe, truly transform security operations from more of a less of a reactive, overworked team to a more proactive, efficient, and effective operation. Now, currently, there are few schools of thought you could say out there. There is this idea of the autonomous analyst. This is where essentially an AI engine has been designed to basically be fully automated and replace a lot of the tier one functionality out there. So that's one option that I'm seeing a lot of when it comes to the products out there in this space. Now, the other thought is more of an augmented analyst, and that's focusing on empowering the current analysts and elevating their abilities, their human capacity, their human capabilities to transform them into awesome, powerful strategic operators. Now, this is how we get ahead of the attackers by taking advantage of these tool sets. And I also say this what can be used for good, I say this a lot when I'm teaching, can be used for bad. So, guess what? Remember, the attackers can also take advantage of these AI tools. They're also leveraging AI, that means. And so that means we must really elevate, we must have our A game, so to speak, on in order to handle these kinds of situations as well. Now, knowing the challenges and opportunities, what should we do as leaders out there? What should we do next? Let's walk through some of the key recommendations that I think are important for us. All right. So where do we go from here? First, we must invest, I think, in AI enhanced tools, that is, not just for the novelty's sake or the hype, that kind of thing, but really to bring the ability to our SOC, to healthcare professionals, that kind of thing, helping them be more precise, helping to scale essentially, not only scale in a workplace environment, but also scale our defenses. And I think also we need to make a lot more conscious effort of making risk reviews as a regular part of our cloud operations. Using tools like CSPMs is a good example of that. Looking for misconfigurations, understanding how things operate from a security posture point of view. Also, really important from a compliance monitoring is to really look closely at things like DevSecOps workflows. So basically, we're automatically looking for issues, through our pipelines and what have you. And really also building a cross-functional instant response capability, making sure that everybody knows what your instant response plan is. Bridge executives, those engineers, those clinicians, everybody that works in healthcare, make sure that they all understand how your instant response plan works. Again, that goes back to being prepared. Basically, we need to go train both our leaders and our technical teams to embrace that thought process as we know in the cloud environment, that shared responsibility model, and how we have good relationships with our cloud providers out there. This really isn't just an IT problem. It's not really just a cybersecurity problem. It's really a healthcare leadership challenge that we need to take on. And I think we can with a lot of these recommendations. Now, these recommendations hopefully help you set the path forward. And basically, to wrap up, I want to leave you with a few other final comments on why leadership and action are so critical today. Healthcare in the cloud, I think it's here to stay. I think there's a lot of movement, to use and leverage the cloud. But of course, securing it is one of the most critical challenges that we talked about in our time. We really can't afford to wait. You don't have to start big. You can start small, so to speak. Maybe it's just as simple as deploying multi-factor authentication or MFA. Maybe it's you just need to go out and start piloting a CSPM package in your environment. It could be as simple as running your own or hiring somebody to run your own tabletop exercise. It is, again, we learn that muscle memory, so to speak, from doing these kinds of exercises out there. But basically, start a lot more collaboration between all the different people in your environment, the CISOs, the executives, the engineers, the business line people, anybody and everybody, get them involved. I say build security champions. That's what it really boils down to me. In my case, the future of healthcare depends not just on innovation, but on trust between all these different groups. And trust really begins with security. All right. So I have a few little things to kind of cover here real quick. So basically, a lot of these concepts that we've been speaking about, they're covered in depth, and I think we've been showing some of the taglines around some of the classes we offer. If you're just starting your journey, Sec 502 happens to be one that I teach. Really love that class; is a great foundation. If you're really interested in going a little deeper, in things like instant response, you can go to Sec 541, Cloud Security Threat Detection. If you're more of on the leadership side, cloud security for leaders, and if you're really more into that dev, area, DevSecOps automation, Sec 540, just a quick glimpse of some of the classes that we have. I've also left my profile out there if you ever want to get a hold of me. I'm on LinkedIn. I really enjoy the conversations I have when I teach and when I work with people at the conferences and really get an opportunity to spread the word and listen to other people and what have you out there. Which brings me to the last little bit here. Again, just a fantastic educational opportunity that's coming up real soon. That's the CloudSec Next Summit. I'll be teaching there actually in this case, but it's an event that's offered for the summit right before the classes are offered. In a virtual presence or in person, if you so please. If you're in the Denver area where I live, we'd love to have you there, of course. And basically, we want to continue the conversation on cloud security